So, Justice Montoya-Lewis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, let's jump right in. I was just curious, how's your re-election campaign going?
Great question. We're geared up. We have lots of volunteers. It's really interesting to do a campaign in this environment, to do it virtually. So I think everybody's learning as we go along. But I've been doing a number of Zoom campaign events each week and getting more and more people involved. I think we're really looking forward to the primary being over. We're not on the primary ballot, so as soon as that is over and we're really focused on the general, along with everyone else, I think we're ready to go.
Sounds great. And I know that this time around, especially with COVID, it's been a challenge. There's not all the physical events to be going to.
Absolutely, it has been very, very odd. But I've lost track now, but a number of interviews for endorsements over the last few months, and what has been kind of inspiring and remarkable to me is the level of involvement in those meetings. And what I've heard is that because people can do it from their home, they're actually having more input, more interaction, more people showing up at meetings than they've had apparently in some cases ever. So where there were endorsement interviews or presentations where you might have 30 people, now there's 100. So it seems like there's been, a pretty intense level of participation, and it's been inspiring to me to see that people really have great questions. They seem really engaged, not just in my campaign, but in other races. So that's been really exciting to see.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. I would have thought the reverse. I would have thought there would have been lower participation, but that sounds great.
Yeah.
I guess another issue, something else that may be happening there is also people maybe they've gotten laid off from their day jobs, or they have other issues, which allows them more time to participate in politics.
Yeah, I think that may well be the case. And there's, I don't know if I would say it's more free time exactly, but it's certainly more of an opportunity for people to kind of focus on the politics, because there's less to do in the evenings. And so in those evening meetings that I've been at various legislative districts, it's just been remarkable in terms of who's there and the kinds of complex issue-based questions they ask.
That's awesome. So I did want to get into some of your earlier career. I know you were judge for the Lummi Nation, the Upper Skagit Indian Tribe, and the Nooksack Indian Tribe. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I was a tribal judge for 15 years before I moved to the Superior Court bench. I started in New Mexico. I was actually a judge for my own tribe. And then when we moved up here about 17 years ago, I started being just a kind of a pro tem judge for Lummi, doing a few cases, and then that pretty quickly became much more of my full-time work than being a professor. And I just started doing judging, not just for Lummi and Upper Skagit and Nooksack. I was chief judge for each of those tribes, but I also served on appellate courts in the tribal courts, as well as doing some cases for tribes that were individual cases that their judge or judges couldn't hear for various reasons. So I've had the opportunity to really do a lot of work in different communities who had different legal systems, different approaches to justice, different approaches to criminal cases, as well as really kind of having the opportunity to get to know all of those communities in a way that you really can't do in the state courts, partially because of time and also because there are so many more restrictions on what the judge can do from the bench. So I also had the opportunity at Nooksack, as well as with a couple of other tribes, to work on court development, to build legal systems that responded to what the community's needs were, what the community wanted, and those were really unique experiences to just have the opportunity to really think about what could a legal system look like, because we weren't required to have a courtroom that looked like every other courtroom, rules of evidence that are the same as they are in state or federal courts. And so that was a really exciting part of my career, to think about how we can develop courts in different ways.
That's cool. What was one of the changes? Because you mentioned a number of changes there. What was one of the changes you were able to, implement?
Well, one of the things that I was asked to do, really at all of the courts that I've worked for in the tribal court arena, was develop child welfare systems that truly focused on the reunification of children. And so as a result of that, just getting involved in looking at what state court systems do, what the tribes wanted to do that was different, talking to experts over the course of that period of time, I became an expert in child welfare, and had the opportunity to teach and train other judges in terms of thinking about what our best practices could be. I have a joint degree in law and social work, and so when I was working on those areas for tribal courts and child welfare, I really had the opportunity to use both of those skill sets. And so, for example, as I just said, we don't necessarily have to have courtrooms that look the way we expect courtrooms to look. Mm-hmm. So we, in one of the tribes that I worked with, really approached the question of just the physical layout of the courtroom by thinking about what is a way to help to get families to be willing to come to court, to want to be there, and to have a conversation with the judge, as opposed to the judge simply telling them what they needed to do and moving on to the next case. So we had kind of a round table that we all sat at for a court hearing in child welfare cases. Parents were there, sometimes kids were there, depending on how old they were. Lawyers were often there, and then social workers, so that we could all kind of lay out what are the issues here, what are the most critical things that the parents needed to address, how could we develop a plan where they could kind of do each of those things in succession. I think in a lot of those kinds of cases in the state court system, we throw 15 things at parents. So we say, you need to get all these things done. And particularly if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't have a car, just trying to get to those appointments alone is a full-time job. So as simple as it sounds, prioritizing for parents and helping them to figure out what the priorities are for them, as opposed to me deciding what the most important thing is. We could have a conversation about that where they would identify those things, be more engaged in following through because it was their idea. Mm-hmm. And over time, developing a relationship of trust where they could have some faith that our goal really was to ensure that their kids were able to live with them and stay with them and be reunified as a family and have the court system out of their lives. So it certainly wasn't a perfect system. It's always a work in progress, but it was certainly much more responsive to the needs of the family. And I think that's always in the best interest of the children.
Totally. You do want to be responsive to the needs of the children and the needs of the families. You said one thing there that made me curious, sit at a round table. Was that a metaphor, or would you literally sit the parties down at a round table?
Literal. It was literal. And in those cases, I mean, we had conversations about, should I wear a robe? Should I not wear a robe to those particular kinds of hearings? We talked to families and kids about what would make them more comfortable and willing to participate. And I kind of experimented with various ways we could do it, and it really did work better to have everyone around a table, and without me having a robe on, I ran the conversation and the meetings. Mm-hmm. They were on the record. They were recorded. They were court hearings. Mm-hmm. But it created a much more of a collaborative approach to the case than it typically does if you are really removed from the people, which is what you are when you're sitting at a bench and you're above everyone else. And there are good reasons to do that. I think that it would be probably sort of shocking to go into a state court and have it look the way that the tribal court looked, but it was something that the community developed, that people all together sort of thought about what's going to work. And mm-hmm. So that was just an amazing opportunity to be able to kind of think, if I have a blank slate here, what can we do?
That I find that to be really interesting, because I don't have deep experience with courts, but obviously the judge is physically elevated and looking down on people. And I do think there is a real emotional component there for authority, because people are used to authority quite literally looking down upon them and rendering judgment upon them. Mm-hmm. And so you have the traditional courtroom being an emotional map of reality, such that people interpret it correctly, interpreting the authority, the judgments, etc. But you seem to have really good results literally sitting at a round table. And my mind went to King Arthur's court, actually. Huh. Sort of everyone coming together and everyone collaborating. So it's an interesting, different emotional map of the scene that actually seems to make it work. So thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I do have this one, and this is unbelievably broad, but what do you think the correct role of the court system is in government?
Yeah, that is a good question. Having worked in lots of systems, I think it is, first of all, critically important that the judicial branch and judges truly are able to make independent decisions, that they're not, sorry, my dog is making a little appearance here, that are...
Pick him or her up.
He's gigantic, so I can't pick him up. Yeah, so I think it is really important that the judiciary be independent and not be in a position where they are concerned that the decisions they make are going to have negative consequences in terms of their future, their employment, that sort of thing. And I think that can certainly be a concern for judges who are elected. I think it's a little bit more attenuated because the elections are 4 or 6 years apart, and I think that gives judges an opportunity to be, for elected, to have voters look at their entire record, not just one case. In my experience in the tribal courts, because the court systems are much smaller and the communities are much smaller, there's a lot more of an opportunity for the governmental bodies, tribal councils, others, to be more willing to cross that line and try to influence what the judge does. I don't think that there's a perfect answer to that, but having had the experience of being concerned that the decision I make might have a consequence to my employment the next day, I really tried to be in a financial position to not be panicked about that. But it was still a concern that I had, and I had to be very conscious of never letting that influence the decisions that I made. When I moved into the state court system, I really never had that concern. I felt completely independent. The only time people talked to me about cases was in the courtroom, and I never had that anxiety. And so I think that that aspect of the way our court systems work in terms of that independence is truly foundational to getting thoughtful, well-reasoned decisions that are not influenced by whatever the winds are of the public at the as that's going on. So
Yeah.
I think that that's really important. And then I think the other thing is that you really want courts systems to have to be as representative as possible of the communities that they serve, because if you don't have that, you begin with a foundation of distrust from the people that are in the court system and the communities that they come from, and I think we have a long way to go as a country with respect to that. But I think if you really want the court system to be functioning in an equitable way, which I hope we all want, but it's certainly been one of the driving forces of my career. If you don't have some confidence on the part of the public with respect to what you're doing, I think it's very difficult to be successful and responsive. And then I guess the last part I'll say with respect to your question is I think that that independence should allow, and I think mostly does, allows the courts to rule on all kinds of issues, not just criminal cases and civil litigation, but on the larger questions that come up through politics and other things. And I think you have to have a legal system that has the ability to intervene when intervention is necessary. And I guess that is sort of the checks and balances that the Constitution has. And maybe I'm not as creative as I should be in terms of thinking about other roles we can serve. But I think we've seen a lot of examples over the last few years where that has been critical to having an external body say, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that, and kind of lay those things out.
Yeah. No, your first point about the purse strings was an interesting one, because obviously that compromises the judiciary if you can get fired or if you're financially unstable with your rulings. That's not an impartial judgment at all. That's, coercion.
Yeah, it absolutely can have an influence. It shouldn't, but it certainly can.
Yeah. So I did want to bring your attention to one recent ruling by the United States Supreme Court, where they ruled that the eastern chunk of Oklahoma should be recognized as part of a reservation. What do you think of that?
That case is remarkable. I have talked to a number of people who've been practicing federal Indian law for, in some cases, decades, and listened to some professors talk about the importance of that decision. That case was first set for oral argument 2 years ago, and we expected it to be decided at the end of the 2019 term. And what the court did instead was reset it for additional oral argument in the 2019-2020 term. And that kind of sent a chill through the spines of all the federal Indian lawyers that I know, thinking, if they have to order additional argument and start over, that probably means that they're at an impasse. The case was released on the very last day of this term, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that tribal lawyers were really not expecting the answer that we got to be the answer we would get. And the decision is very thoughtful in the way that it kind of goes through each argument that Oklahoma had, opposing the view that the reservation could extend that far. And really, it was a relatively straightforward question in the sense that it was the application of the rule that treaties are the supreme law of the land, and only Congress can change the boundaries of a reservation. They have to do it explicitly. There was no evidence that that had ever happened, and I think Justice Gorsuch did a very thorough job in laying that out. So what do I think about the importance of that decision? I think it's very important in reaffirming that foundational principle that if the federal government made promises to Indian tribes, they're required to uphold those. That foundational question, as perhaps as obvious as it looks, that has not been the answer from the Supreme Court numerous times.
Yeah.
So that reaffirmation was really important.
No, it's fascinating for me because I'm not an attorney, nor am I technically a historian, though I've read a lot. It does seem that the U.S. government, whatever form that has taken, has a pretty obvious track record of making treaties and contracts and then completely ignoring them later with Native nations. And seeing that reversed is fascinating. And then also, what does that say about quite literally every other contract that, was broken? So
that's an excellent question. I think that is an open question about what that means. The case is fairly unique in terms of the factual scenario and the way that the treaties were negotiated and what they say. But that foundational question and the way in which the court answered it, I think does give tribes an opportunity to use that precedent in future cases, and there are many cases already in the works that are really based on that question. What were the promises that were made, and are the courts going to require the United States to keep them? And I think the Supreme Court said yes. So it is a remarkable outcome. And I think Oklahoma's arguments in that case were largely based on this argument that it wouldn't work to have that portion of Oklahoma determined to be Indian country. And I think that we don't know how it's going to work. I think that is very much an open question with respect to jurisdiction and where cases go, and all of those kinds of things are going to have complicated answers. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do what the law requires us to do just because it's hard or it's maybe unprecedented in a case like this. So I think there's a lot that will come of that, both for that specific situation as well as larger questions around those kinds of things.
No, to be absolutely nerdy for a moment, you are reminding me of a line from J.K. Rowling's, I think it's the third one, The Prisoner of Azkaban. It's time for you to make a choice between what is easy and what is right. And you reminded me of that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So pivoting a little more to some sort of personal legal issues, in colleges, in universities, and especially amongst all cohorts of young people that I know, mental health issues are becoming increasingly common and increasingly talked about. I know there's a lot of people talking about the stigma. I have many friends who, I know I live in Seattle, but I have never run into that. And I've heard many people who have different various mental health issues. I'm curious about the legal implications there, both on treating and accommodating or not accommodating those, and then how those play out in sort of the case law of, well, what are the causative agents in, this crime or this action?
That is a very active area of the law. I think that we, as a legal system, are are managing those issues pretty poorly. And I don't think that that's even much of a controversial statement, frankly. I think particularly in Washington, but there have been issues raised across the country. We are seeing significant increases in people coming into court with mental health issues. And there's a wide range of what that looks like and how that impacts cases. In Washington, if an attorney says to the court, I think my client may not be competent to proceed, the court is really bound, essentially, to order that person to be evaluated by the state hospital. In this case, Western State Hospital is the most common on this side of the mountains, but there are 2 or 3 others across the state. If that happens and the person is in jail, they are often looking at 3 to 4 months before they even get a date to be evaluated. So they may be in a situation where they got arrested because they were trespassed from a grocery store, and then they went back to that grocery store and stole a sandwich. That's a felony because they were already trespassed from the store, and then they go back. That bumps it up to a felony. So they would be in superior courts. Somebody would say, I don't think this person's competent to stand trial. Maybe it takes them 3 months to get an evaluation. If that evaluation says this person is not competent and we recommend that they be sent back to Western State or one of the other hospitals for restoration, which means typically medication, participation in therapy, other things, so they get to the point of being able to resolve their case and be restored to competency. Sometimes they're in that system 7-8 months for a case that would be resolved with a jail term of 15 days. And it is Kafkaesque. It creates just incredible problems. I have seen literally hundreds of people, while they're waiting to get an evaluation, get sicker and sicker and sicker in the jail. They don't understand why they're there. They're not getting services while they're there. They're very often held in isolation because as their symptoms get worse, they're more disruptive in the jail. And
a jail does not strike me as a therapeutic environment.
It is absolutely not. Yeah, it is. It's dangerous. It's unhealthy. And it's wrong. And those were the cases and the people that really kept me up at night as a judge, because there wasn't much I could do to make the system work better. And these people were just caught in that system and not getting any help. And oftentimes what would end up happening is they would get the medication they needed and other services in order to come into court and resolve their case. They would get out the next day and still not have any support once they've left. And, then they would be back in a month because they don't have access to their medication. The symptoms recur, and then they're, getting into trouble again.
Yeah.
So I think on the level of when you have mental health issues that are truly impacting people's ability to do daily living activities, and they're so impacted by whatever's going on that they are getting into criminal trouble. We have poor solutions for that. There are other scenarios, I think, where we're a little bit better if somebody's in the child welfare system as a parent. I think we have much better resources to help those people get the support that they need in order to continue to parent. But as a court system, we really see the symptoms of those problems. And so trying to kind of retrofit solutions is very difficult because we're not doctors, we're not therapists. We're limited in our understanding of what's going on and what the appropriate services are going to be. My view has always been that time and money would be far better spent at a prevention side end of things. But I think you're right that there is stigma associated with that. I think there's not a tremendous amount of public support for devoting those financial resources at the prevention side. I think there's just not a public or political effort to help people to understand why that would be beneficial in the long run, and a better allocation of resources. So I think all of that is very tricky, and I think I think the problem is only going to get more complicated, and we're either going to keep doing it the way we've been doing it, or we're going to have to figure out a different way to allocate those resources and really help people to get the help that they need.
Yeah, no, and this sort of walks into the broader issue that our medical system is, especially in the time of Corona, is wildly stretched to the breaking point and in serious need of assistance, both from mental health and for every other thing.
Yeah, and I think that it is kind of the perfect storm, because you have people who need, in some cases, tremendous amounts of medical support in order to survive this illness. But there's also the mental health consequences that I know I see in the people that I know, and I've also talked to people who work in mental health who are seeing it across the board. In fact, I had someone say, I'm no longer a mental health therapist, I'm a COVID therapist, because what they're seeing is people just trying to figure out how to deal with the trauma of watching this happen, and being afraid to be out in public, and trying to sort out, how do I live my life when I've lost my job, I don't have any idea if I'll be able to be employed, I don't know where my next paycheck is coming from, and I'm afraid to go to the grocery store. I think that's just going to get worse, particularly I think for young people, if the longer this isolation goes on. And I expect that it'll have long-term ramifications.
Yeah, totally. No, it's interesting how it's you have the objective reality problems. You have an infectious disease, you were laid off, you've got, real problems. And then you've also got the psychological reaction to those problems.
Yep.
And the coping, and how that, I guess, is magnifying those issues in some instances. I don't want to belittle those, because those are genuine issues, getting like whatever. But it's the two-part problem of the actual issues, and then how do you deal with them emotionally and psychologically.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. So one of the things I did want to touch on is, as you may have noticed, there have been some protests recently.
Yep.
And on YouTube, there's an ongoing dialogue about what the First Amendment means. And I see it as a dialogue about what the First Amendment means. People, I guess the way it's placed in most of the media is, should it be a protest? Is it a protest versus a riot? What about canceling someone's YouTube channel or other things? For side A says that it was, side A says that, well, it was hate speech or incorrect. Side B says, well, actually, no, you're just trying to suppress the views that you don't adhere to. So I was wondering if you could talk about what freedom of speech means in 2020.
Huge question. I think that it's really important when we talk about this question to separate the kind of public protest that we're seeing people engage in the streets, or they're going to outside the legislature's building or the city hall or whatever it is, federal courthouses, and protesting. I think people have a right to do that, and that doesn't mean that they can do whatever they want. I think there are reasonable structures around, time of day is sometimes something that there'll be regulations about with respect to what you can, when you can do certain things. Sometimes there's regulations about where you can protest, and there's been case law around when those kinds of regulations are appropriate, when they're not allowed. I think so. I think that there is pretty clear case law about what the First Amendment means when we're talking about those kinds of issues and public participation in political debate. A question about, is it an exercise of your freedom of speech to decide not to wear a mask and demand to be let into a private business like a store? That's a different question, because a store can require you to have shoes on too. So, the question for me when you think about those things is that a political speech that should be protected? If someone says, I want to come into the store, but I don't want to comply with your mask requirements. So that gets to then the question of what is the platform of something like YouTube? Is that more like a public utility or a public space, like a park where you might have a protest? Or is it really something that is something that you have permission to engage in because you agree with whatever the policies are of the company itself that's running the platform? So if they say, we're not going to allow hate speech on this platform, they define what that hate speech is, someone violates that and gets their channel banned. Is that a violation of free speech? I don't know that we have a real clear legal answer to that question, because I do think something like YouTube is becoming much more of the public space where people protest or people say what they think. So the regulation of that is I think, somewhat of an open question. But it seems to me that it's much more like a contract. When you say, I'm going to put my channel up and want to put my videos up, and you've agreed to their terms of service, and if their terms of service says you can't do this, I think there's much less of a strong legal leg to stand on to say it's a violation of my free speech if you block me.
I'd like to totally agree with you and totally disagree simultaneously.
Okay.
So I totally agree that as a private company, they can police their platform and enact, whatever policies they see fit as for their platform. I can totally see that. I also see that many of the speech codes or speech directives are legally worded in an obfuscatory manner in which to make any and all decisions opaque. And in addition, they seem to be capriciously enforced. And that's an observation that is not just me. So that's the one side, which is ideally you have objective laws and objective rules which people can follow. In practice, whether it's the broader legal system or YouTube's terms of service, laws tend to be applied capriciously. And just seeing how that manifests is really interesting, and how the enforcement goes. And then the second point was, and you did touch on this in the social forum, this is in the 21st century, this is sort of the public square. The internet is the public square. And we used to have things like in England, they had Hyde Park, where anyone who wanted to could get on, stand up and say, well, here's what I think about government,
Yeah, speaker's corner.
Totally. And there's something truly beautiful about that. But what you do have is, according with social network effects, and that's just the nature of that sort of thing, you do have a few big media aggregate players who tend to take 90% and upward of the market share. And that's just a property of the social networks of marketplaces and platforms. So you do really have a thing where if you get banned because you have a crazy idea, no one gets to hear your idea. And then you don't really have a marketplace of ideas. You have the marketplace of approved ideas, which is a way of limiting the scope of the conversation without explicitly doing so. So.
Yeah, I think that that's a really clear way to lay out the problems. You know, I think that one of the aspects of that adds to that complexity. I don't spend a lot of time on YouTube, but my husband does, and so do my kids, who are teenagers. And one thing that has been sort of terrifying to me is to see what comes up as recommended, like that underlying algorithm.
Yeah.
And there's been, it's not just my anecdotal observation, but there's been a lot of writing about that they are all, for I think different reasons, constantly getting suggestions that are videos of people who are white supremacists, that this is sort of fed into their algorithm. And my husband in particular has really tried to play with it to try to figure out why that's happening. And, you know, he's taken all of the steps that YouTube says to sort of make that stop, saying, you know, I don't want to see this, that kind of thing. And it's still continuing to happen. I have no idea what the underlying algorithm is that's creating that, but it is remarkable to me that feedback loop seems to be happening. And I worry about the impact of that kind of thing on, particularly on young people who aren't maybe as sophisticated as Colin is in terms of being able to recognize what's happening.
Yeah, no, there's definitely, I can't speak to YouTube's algorithm. I can speak to some aspects of human nature and how that intersects with the algorithm. Strong opinions and either strong anger, strong revulsion, strong happiness, it's an excited feeling. You get tense, you get angry, you feel self-righteous or challenged, and all of those help to get, it's like an addictive cycle, those emotions. And you're, as any platform does, you're trying to hook people into the next click, the next video, the next consuming more content. So that's the human biochemical basis. But if you want to block that out, I can see that as difficult because you can filter some of it, but A, the algorithm isn't going to be perfect, the filter, and then B, the whole incentive of the platform is to have you watch more media. So they're incentivized to give you something that's a little edgy, a little crazier, a little, you know, all of those. So there was a thing about compelled speech up in Canada with passing laws to compel the use of personal pronouns. I'm curious where you think compelled speech falls amongst free speech.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that is something that should be pretty limited. I taught at Western Washington University for a number of years. I also taught at the law school in New Mexico. And over the course of my career in academia, which was about 15, 16 years long, I saw a real shift in the expectations of students about what should happen in a classroom. And the language that was often used around that was, and I heard faculty talk about this too, was, the classroom should be a safe space. I had a very strong reaction to that as someone who had been very often the only Native person in a class, the vast majority of my education. My experience of education had been that it was never safe. It was never safe to be who I was. There were always things that would come up in the classroom that would make me feel like an outsider, or that would demonstrate that I was in fact an outsider. So I'd never had the experience of feeling like the classroom was a safe space. And I became fairly convinced over my academic career that the place where people really did the most learning was where they were uncomfortable, not where they were threatened, but where they were sort of at the edge of their skill set. They were uncomfortable. They were really forced to explore what that discomfort was around. And so for me, the idea of protecting students from that, my sense of that was that the result of that would be that all of their ideas that they came into the classroom would rarely be challenged. Mm-hmm. I got a lot of pushback from that belief, and because I think people heard me as saying people should be able to say whatever they want, and that was not what I was saying. I was simply saying I think where you learn is where you have to get to the point of admitting you don't know something, or that what you think you know should be questioned. That's where I think where the learning happens. Mm-hmm. That said, I think the pronoun question is a really interesting one. When I work with young people, whether they're coming to visit the Temple of Justice, whether they were coming in to sit in my courtroom in Superior Court and watch court, pretty much universally, anyone under the age of 25 or 30 would introduce themselves with their name and their pronouns. It was a very simple way of respecting the other people in the room. And I thought that was, I think that is a really positive thing. I think it's a really good thing. I actually have my pronouns in my signature block for my Supreme Court email, and I've been a little bit surprised that I've gotten some pushback about that. I've had people write back and say, why do you do this? This is taking a political position, which blew my mind, but it hasn't just been once that people have said that they thought it was inappropriate. I don't know that I view that as compelled speech so much as I view it as part of societal change. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a positive thing, because my hope is that makes more people feel welcome into the public debate about whatever we're talking about. But I don't know that I think it's something where you should be required to do that. But instead, I think society is changing. It's going to continue to change, and we have to be adaptable to that change.
Yeah. No, people can choose what they want to do, but I do think litigation compelling speech is, I think that's the line, or that's one of the lines. Mm-hmm. People can, share what they want, present themselves how they want, etc. But the compelled speech, that's something that I have an issue with, is the mm-hmm. compelling someone else to say something. So slightly different legal topic. LFOs, legal financial obligations, are commonly inflicted on many people in the legal system. And I know of at least more than one case where people, were, say, dealing drugs, they were getting LFOs in addition to other things. How can they make the money to pay them off? Well, the only thing they know is dealing drugs, so naturally that's how you pay that off. I'm just curious what you think the role of LFOs is, and then what you think it should be.
I have pretty strong views about this. I think that...
Well, don't hold back.
I think it is bizarre to have a legal system that functions in part on the revenue that comes in from people who can't afford to pay you. So if I'm sentencing someone to 2 years in prison and saying, when you come out, you need to pay $3,000 of legal financial obligations, and it's not part of your punishment, it's just fines associated with having been in the system. What that does is it sets those people to come out of whatever they've, whatever period of time they've been in custody, already in a hole.
Mm-hmm.
They're already in debt. And I did many hearings as a Superior Court judge where I remitted legal financial obligations when people came in to ask that. And I saw people that had legal financial obligations in the tens of thousands of dollars. And many of them were making serious attempts to try to pay it, but because there was also interest happening, it was just impossible. It's like having a credit card bill that you can never really get on top of. Mm-hmm. So I don't understand the logic behind a structure that says we're going to punish you and then you're going to pay for it later. It's just bizarre to me. And so my view,
in some elements, to me at least, but please go ahead. With you.
No. So I think that, whenever I had the opportunity to remit that interest or the legal financial obligations, I don't think I ever denied those. And I would impose the least legal financial obligations I was able to do, unless I had someone who truly had the ability to pay. And occasionally I did, but the vast majority of people don't have the ability to pay. And there were still legal financial obligations that I could not zero out, but because the legislature said they were compulsory, I didn't have the flexibility to take someone's ability to pay into my calculation of their fines. It seems to me if you're going to have a legal system that you need to fund, then you should fund it, and you shouldn't fund it based on someone who's gotten into trouble's ability to do it, because it is, at its most sort of baseline problem, you're going to spend more time on collections than you're going to get anyway. But it seems like a problem of fundamental fairness to me. If we want a legal system that's funded, we should fund it, and we shouldn't fund it that way. So I have pretty strong feelings about that.
Yeah, well, if Elon Musk makes a tweet about Tesla or pot or something, and the SEC finds him $10 or $20 million, he can totally pay that.
Right.
But other people aren't usually in that camp.
Most people are absolutely not. And when I was in drug court, I presided over drug court about 2.5 years, and we had they were required to pay. That they had restitution, they had to do that before they graduated from drug court. And then they had kind of a drug court fee that they paid every month. If they couldn't pay it, we just waited until they could. But our job in drug court was to ensure that people got treatment, completed it, that they had safe and secure and stable housing, that they had at least a GED or were in school, in a community college, for example, and they had employment. So the whole point of the time that they were there was to get them in a position where they could learn how to budget money, be supported in figuring out how to do that, how to get a job, what to do once they'd gotten it. And then they, in my view, would have sort of an opportunity through those fees to feel some success in being able to take care of their responsibilities. And for the most part, that was the way people responded to it, by saying, I was able to pay this month, and that feels good that I was able to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you're going to do that, you have to ensure people have the ability to do it, or you have to help them develop the skills to do it, which is what we did in a therapeutic environment in the therapeutic drug court. But for the most part, most people are not going to be in that situation. They're going to be coming in, figuring out that we're going to resolve the case. They're going to serve whatever amount of time they serve, and then they come out with this big bill. And I just don't think that that's fair.
Yeah, no, and it drags them back in. It's terrible.
Absolutely, yes.
You touched on this. You said you were on a drug court, and I actually wanted to dive a little deeper into that. We've had this, in the US, we've had this war on drugs thing going on for almost 50 years now, at least according to Wikipedia. I've seen remarkably almost, I mean, I grew up during the DARE days of the 90s and all that, but I don't think that has been much of a success. And I think that we haven't been successful at all in dealing with legitimate drug issues or in dealing with substances in a responsible manner. Mm-hmm. I'm curious how you think the legal system is doing what it's doing now and then what it's evolving into, or what the change could be.
I think in therapeutic drug courts around the country, there's very good data that demonstrates that those are successful programs, and that if you really approach that problem with an intention as a court and as a drug court team to support people to get out of that cycle, and that you can help them be successful and help them to get into recovery and get a job, finish their education, whatever those things are that their needs are. The thing that is difficult about that is that truly takes a team of people. It takes a long time. So if someone is perfect in drug court, at least in our drug court, they could be done in a year. Very few people are perfect. And so that we have people that have been in drug court for, 2.5 years before they complete. That just was the amount of time it took them to get to where they needed to be. And the team that I worked with was willing to work with people for pretty much as long as it took. So I think there are models out there that have been well studied that we know support people in getting into recovery. Mm-hmm. We don't do enough of that by any stretch in any legal system. So what we end up primarily doing is just, arresting the same people for possession of whatever the drug is. They get a felony charge, they serve 5 days, 15 days, maybe they serve a year, then they're back out. And they're just going back and forth, and they're never getting help for their underlying issues. And I think that is sort of crazy that we have an expectation that the accumulation of felony charges for things like possession is really going to have an effect on someone to decide, like, I'm going to clean up on my own. It's impossible. Nobody does it on their own. Mm-hmm. So I think that the sort of war on drugs is a failure if the goal was to eliminate addiction, and that was certainly what it seemed to me to be about. I've seen it have virtually no impact, and I think when we have situations like what we're heading into in terms of the economy, and people not having jobs, maybe that's affecting their housing. If not immediately, then it will. We will see an increase in drug use and drug abuse and drug addiction. So those problems are just going to be more front and center, I think, over the coming, the next few years. If we keep trying to do this, resolve it, doing the same thing we've been doing, I don't think it's going to make any difference.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a problem.
Yep.
It's a problem. And figuring out how to move forward is socially is one thing, and then legally is another stone to keep rolling up the mountain. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Well, thank you. Getting international for a minute, the CCP is currently detaining the Uyghur ethnic minority in internment camps, using them for forced labor and having them under 24/7 surveillance. I'm just curious, this is obviously outside the US and outside, possibly your knowledge base, but what are your thoughts on what the CCP has been doing?
Yeah, you're right. I don't have a lot of expertise in that, but I do find it fairly shocking that that is sort of an open secret that that's going on, and that from what I've seen, there's been fairly minimal, if any, international response to that. We have centuries of examples of all kinds of countries, including our own, in engaging in wars of genocide. I don't think in today's world that there are many governments or people who believe that that was a good thing. So I don't understand why there's not more of an open discussion and action being taken with respect to what's happening in China. I understand that there are forces far beyond my, what I understand about the world that have an influence on whether governments respond to things like that. But it seems to me to be a pretty basic issue of human rights that as a world we should be talking about and addressing. I find it to be pretty frightening that we're not. And, I do a lot of public speaking about the impact of federal policies on Native American communities, and I start in the 1800s and I bring the talk up to present day. Those policies of attempting to wipe out the Native American tribes that were living in this country prior to first contact are policies that continue to have impacts on Native people today. So I think that it's not an exaggeration to say that those things have ramifications centuries later. And it seems to me that as a country, in terms of the United States, we could speak with some authority about why that's something that shouldn't be happening in other countries. How we do that is a different question, but it certainly seems to me to be something that should be much more of a public discussion and part of the discussion at the national political level than I'm hearing it be.
Yeah, no, I've been alarmed by the complete and utter silence that I've heard. And that's it's just one of those things when I hear people talking about Nazi Germany or Rwanda or other atrocities that have been committed historically. And then you're like, oh, well, look, here's something that looks like that. What are we doing? And then you're like, oh, well, people are just not going to look over there. So that's it's just one of those, makes me lose faith in some aspects of the international community then. We've gone over our hour. I really would like to keep going. Are you okay with that? Or
I can do it for a little bit more, yeah. Maybe about 10 more minutes.
Okay, cool. So yeah, you have taught classes on implicit bias. I guess I wanted to ask, what role do you see implicit bias playing, and then what role do you see the recognition of implicit bias playing in our court system and society?
I think that I'm very glad that there's a more active conversation and work being done in that area. I think we have a very long way to go. I have been teaching in this area for about 15 years. I've trained judges in Washington and all over the country. I'm a nationally recognized speaker and expert on these questions. So I have very strong feelings about it. I think that it is critical as a legal system that we all just admit that our biases influence decision making. That seems to be a pretty controversial position to take even now. And I remain a little bit baffled by why it's so frightening for people to admit that there are things rattling around in their head that maybe they're not proud of, and maybe they don't want to talk about it publicly, but they're there. And I really struggle sometimes with people who are unwilling to say that's even there in their head. One of the things I do when I do my training, I bring these in as props. Sometimes I just use it as slides in PowerPoint, but I just bring in a series of images that I try to pick from advertisements and products and other things that are current. That as by way of example, I did one where I had probably 15 different products that I either took pictures of on the grocery store shelves or in my own kitchen that had stereotypical images of Native people. Mm-hmm. So whether that was national football team's mascot, or the woman that is sort of coming out of is really an ear of corn on the Argo cornstarch. There's tons of them that you can pick from. You can look at Mrs. Butterworth's, the bottle of pancake syrup, which I understand they're phasing out, but they're still in the stores right now. There's just all kinds of subtle ways that we're taught that some people are less human than others, that some people, that you can create a caricature of someone, and that can sort of be the representation that someone ever sees of the Native community, for example. Those absolutely have an influence on what we do, and there's decades of data that shows that, and there's also data that shows that has looked at judges and just decision making and how those things have an impact on decision making. So I think it continues to be surprising to me that that's a controversial position to take, but the feedback I get is that it is a controversial position to take. Until we are able to have a really honest conversation about that, I think what we're going to continue to see is wide disproportionality at every step of the way in the criminal system, from who gets arrested, who gets charged, who actually goes to trial, and who ends up being convicted, and how long their sentences are. We will continue to see wide disproportionality across the board, and we do. We see much higher rates of Black folks, particularly Black men, getting arrested, getting prosecuted, getting sentenced to prison terms. Those terms are typically longer than their white counterparts who might be charged with the same crime. There's just all kinds of data that demonstrate that that's the case. When we look at the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, all of those things have been studied and shown to have wide disproportionate impacts on communities of color. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to really push, and I hope that that's something I will have the opportunity to continue to do as a Supreme Court justice over the rest of my career, in getting people to move beyond what I think is a pretty natural defensive reaction to being willing to explore that and learn how to be better decision makers. So I think that it has a huge impact at every level in virtually every area, not just the criminal system.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. It's illustrative of where we are and who we are as humans, the humans that the fallible, normal humans. Briefly, in the last few minutes, I was wondering if you could give us just a little background on your path to becoming a judge on the Supreme Court, and then leave us with a closing thought.
Okay. Well, when I went to law school, I never planned to be a lawyer, much less a judge. And being on any Supreme Court seemed, it wasn't even really something I thought about, to be perfectly honest. I was interested in teaching, and I was interested in understanding how the institution of law impacted people. That's why I went to law school. I did end up practicing for a few years, and very early on started serving as a tribal court judge. There was a huge need in tribes to have judges who were law trained and could manage big caseloads and complex litigation. And so I was able to do that. And I started doing that very early in my career. I really went into that thinking, I would do a few cases, but really my focus was going to be on teaching. And over time, the judging became much more of what my time, and the teaching became less of my time. And I think that's because I really like being hands-on and helping people to solve problems. I like being a part of those solutions. I like seeing people be successful over time, and certainly the opportunity to work in legal systems and create legal systems and being a part of that was just a wonderful part of my career. But as I said, over time, my judicial work became much more of what I did, and when I made the move into Superior Court, I was asked to apply for the appointment to that position. I really did not expect that I would get it, in large part because I did not see anyone in the country who'd made the move from being a tribal court judge to being a state court judge. There was no one that I could talk to about how did that happen. And there was no one, certainly in the state of Washington at the time. I was the only Native judge at any level in the state system. So it wasn't like there was someone I could call to say, hey, how did you do that? And was it a good choice? And all of those kinds of things. So I was very surprised, happily so, that Governor Inslee appointed me to the Superior Court bench. And I loved that work. I loved being in the courtroom. I loved, working on all kinds of cases. I was working in Whatcom County, which had a large caseload and only 4 judges. So each week, frankly, each day was different. Sometimes I'd be doing a criminal trial. The next day, I'd be doing, a child custody case. It was just varied work, and it was exciting work. When the Supreme Court position came open, again, I was asked to consider applying. And I had the same sort of experience. There was one person in Minnesota who was on the state Supreme Court who was of Native descent, and I didn't know of anyone else. So it didn't seem likely, I guess, because I knew if I got the position, I'd be the first Native person in the state of Washington to be on the Supreme Court, and also the first enrolled tribal member, apparently in U.S. history, to be on any state Supreme Court. So it seemed like quite a reach, and it also was a difficult decision to apply because I really liked what I was doing in Superior Court, and would have been very happy to continue doing that for years to come. But I had a mentor of mine who's been a support and a mentor of mine since law school, who said, it's really not up to you who gets the position. It's up to you to give the governor, and subsequent to that, if you get the position and you go to an election, the people of the state, the opportunity to make that choice. And if we don't continue to put ourselves out there as viable options, then no one no one from the Native community will get there. And that hit home for me. So I really have been thrilled with the last 7 months of being on the Supreme Court. It's very different work from the work I've done as a trial court judge, but it's incredibly interesting, and it's really important work. And I am grateful to work with 8 other justices who understand how important the work is that we're doing is, and the impact it has on the citizens of the state of Washington. I think everyone takes that charge very seriously, and I'm grateful to work with people who see that and are passionate about getting to the right decision, even if we don't all agree on what the correct decision is. I think we all have faith in each other that we are doing what we think is best, even if we don't agree on what that route is, or even sometimes what the outcome is. So I feel very honored to be among those people, and I also think it's a really important part of the legal system to have a Supreme Court. In the state of Washington, we're the most diverse court in the country. I think it's critical that we have courts that reflect the communities we serve, and while doing this kind of work with a very diverse group of people is difficult, because we all come from different backgrounds and have very strong views, and sometimes those views are distinct from each other in significant ways. And so that work is difficult. I think it's much more meaningful because we really kind of look like the state of Washington looks. It's not perfect, but it is an exciting place to be right now.
Yeah. Well, Justice Montoya-Lewis, thank you so much for your time and for your thoughts. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity, Aaron. I really appreciate it too.
Mm-hmm.